Think fast, because you're on the clock. The deadline to contribute to your RRSP for the 2025 fiscal year is March 2nd, 2026. And this can be a great opportunity to slash your tax bill and get you closer to your retirement goals, if you know how to take advantage of it, that is. And if you don't, you're in luck. This financial over here is here with her top RRSP investing strategies ahead of the contribution cutoff. So let's find out which strategies might save and earn you a boatload of money. You're watching Inside Investing. Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Inside Investing, the show that helps you level up your financial knowledge and sharpen your investing skills. Presented by TD Direct Investing, named Canada's best online brokerage by the Globe and Mail for 3 straight years and counting. I'm your host, Rob Moise. And if you're anything like me, you often need a firm deadline to get your act in gear. I admit that it's true of me. It's crunch time for your RRSP. So if you want to take some advantage of some of that money that's left up on the table, it's up for grabs. Let's go get it. And let's not waste another minute. Joining us is Jacqueline Ozdemir. She's a financial advisor with Ferguson Financial Planning, a division of CI Assante Wealth Management Limited. Jacqueline, it's great to have you back in studio with us. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rob. It's nice to be back here with you and your audience.
Absolutely. You did such a good job with the RESP tips. We had to have you back in time for RRSP season, so we appreciate you joining. We're going to get into some of your strategies ahead of the contribution deadline. But before we do, maybe just give our audience a quick rundown of the RRSP. How does it work at a high level?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great idea before we jump in. So really quick, an RRSP is a tax-deferred investment account. So you can put money into it. You can invest in things like stocks, bonds, GICs, mutual funds, ETFs. But essentially, when you put money into the account, you get a deduction off your income. And that's a lot of times why people see that they get a reduction of taxes owing or a tax refund. So real quick, if I make $100,000 a year and I put $5,000 into my RSP, when I file my taxes, CRA sees that I really only made $95,000 and will tax me accordingly, which is a lot of times why I wind up getting a bit of a refund. Certain things to keep in mind, this is a great account, but you can't put all your money into it. There is contribution limits, 18% of your annual income or $33,000, whatever is lesser. Notice that I referred to the account as a tax-deferred investment account. What that means is when the money goes in and you invest it, if you get capital gains, dividends, interest, that's not taxed. However, you are taxed when you take money out of the account, generally in retirement. Obviously, there's exceptions to that, like the home buyer's plan. We're not really going to touch on that too much, but it is a tax-deferred investment account. Yeah,
and actually, it's a common myth that I've heard from the uninitiated that, I don't want to contribute to my RRSP because I don't want to get double taxed. You're not getting double taxed, right? Yes.
No, that's true. Yeah, you put money in, and the idea is that the tax refund that you get today while you're working in your higher income years is greater than the tax you'll pay in the future when you take money out, presumably at a lower tax rate when you're retired.
Now, I could see some folks are really motivated by this RRSP deadline. Others might say, like, what's the big deal if I don't meet the deadline? What are they potentially leaving on the table if they don't get their money into the account before that?
Yes, good question. So if you're like thinking about making a contribution, but you just don't get around to it, keep in mind that it's always better to have money in your pocket today than later. And so if I wait to make that RRSP contribution and I don't make it before the deadline, if I was expecting a refund by making the contribution, I'm not going to get the refund, right? And so that means that money that I don't have in my pocket today that I don't have available to invest and take advantage of things like compounding interest within the RRSP account.
And of course, like, we're going to talk about strategies specific to, ahead of the contribution deadline. But like in general, do you think there are things that people need to keep in mind when they're using an RRSP?
Yeah, I think if we could break it down to like 3 kind of really quick suggestions beyond sort of bigger strategies, it would be, number 1, contribute as much as you can as early as you can. So the power of compounding interest is real. Like, it has a really big impact. And just to put it into perspective, I'll use some sort of general numbers here, but imagine I'm a young investor and I'm going to contribute $10,000 a year to my RRSP for maybe 40 years. Like, that's not completely unrealistic to think that I could do that. And so I put $10,000 a year in, assuming you have the room, and we'll get to that later. I put $10,000 in a year, and let's say I'm a bit more of an aggressive investor, and so after fees and all that, I earn about 7% a year. That $10,000 a year, every year saving that for 40 years, could yield up to $2 million, which is pretty substantial considering I only actually put in $400,000. What's even a little bit more crazy if we break it down is if I just put in $10,000 and let that grow for 40 years at 7%, that would be worth about $140,000 in 40 years. So that's a pretty big portion of that $2 million that I could have, considering it only made up about 2.5% of my initial contribution.
$2 million, I think I could work with that.
We can work with $2 million, yes. And then, so on top of that, so, contribute as early as you can, as much as you can. Another big one to consider is asset mix. And so sometimes what I hear a lot is it's a retirement account, it should be conservative. Not always the case, right? Especially if I'm in my 20s, 30s, even my 40s. I'm probably not touching this money for a very long time. And so I might be able to afford to take on a little bit more risk. Now, we don't need to do anything crazy. I just mean maybe a higher equity exposure compared to bonds, for example. I don't need to be buying GICs at 30 years old necessarily in my RSP, provided that's in my risk tolerance. The younger we are, the more we can afford to kind of get through the ups and downs that naturally occur in the market. So that would be one suggestion. And I would even argue that if I'm 60, I don't need to go necessarily all conservative. Again, this is, making sure we've looked at an investor's risk tolerance. But if you're 60 and you're retiring in a few years, it's not like you're taking all your money out on day one. And so some of the money in the RSP, you might not be touching even for another 20 years. So consider creating little buckets of more conservative assets that you need sooner and stuff that you're not going to touch for a long time. Like you could consider going more growth oriented, which again plays into that whole idea of compounding interest. Just a caveat to that, if you're maybe a younger investor that's saving up for a home and you plan to take money out under the home buyer's plan, maybe you consider going a little bit more conservative because you might actually need the money in 3 to 5 years, not 40 years from now. So just wanted to point that out. Another thing that's probably easier said than done to consider is try not to spend your RSP refund. So if you get an RSP refund, I totally appreciate that it's easier said than done not to spend it. But remember, if you get a refund, it's because you've overpaid taxes in some capacity. And so if you spend the refund on something you don't necessarily need, you're not really taking advantage of that strategy. So instead, I would encourage investors to maybe spend the money on making a TFSA contribution or even considering putting money into their RSP for next year. Or if they had to borrow money to make an RSP contribution, consider paying that back.
It can be incredibly tempting. Guilty as charged, I have spent my RSP tax refund, but not anymore. And perhaps what we're going to talk about now is going to help people understand maybe why they shouldn't do that and get into some of the finer points of the account. So let's get into it. We have some great strategies on tap here that we're going to talk about that you can use ahead of the contribution deadline. If you're in the audience and you want to get involved in the conversation, you can do that. Okay, make sure you submit your questions to Jacqueline. We have a live viewer Q&A coming up towards the end of the show. If you're watching on Webbroker, you can use the chat box to send your questions to us. If you're watching on our broadcast platform, it's the questions and comments box. And if you're watching on our YouTube live stream, you can click on the link in the description and it'll take you over to the broadcast platform. That's where you can ask your question. Okay, Jacqueline, your first strategy is to double check the annual and lifetime contribution room that you have for an RRSP. Okay, this sounds like a super obvious thing, but it actually trips up people more than you might think. Take us through why that is.
Yes, okay, great question. And so exactly like you said, knowing your RSP room. So that might seem very simple, but it's not always as straightforward as you might think. And I really want to point this out because if you over contribute to your RSP, which means putting more money in than you're allowed, fixing it is pretty time consuming and also involves a lot of really complicated CRA forms. So my recommendation is not to do it.
That doesn't sound like fun.
Just to kind of like break down how this could easily happen, because you think, oh, well, how could this possibly happen? A very straightforward example that I've even seen happen is maybe I'm a T4 employee, I get a paycheck every 2 weeks from my employer, and a lot of employers nowadays have plans like group RSP programs. And so what that is it is a RSP program that my employer has set up sort of on my behalf. A lot of times they're held at maybe a big insurance company or one of the big banks, and basically money comes off my paycheck every week and it goes to this group RSP. And in a lot of cases, my employer is matching it. So not only am I putting money in, but I'm also getting extra money put into my RSP from my employer. All of that chips away at our contribution room. So you think, okay, well, that's pretty straightforward. Well, also, let's remember that a lot of employers also offer bonuses or maybe restricted stock unit compensation. So again, that's extra money you're getting, and sometimes you're allowed to put that money into your RSP and you don't even think about it. But if you've contributed quite a bit through your regular payroll deductions and now there's a lump sum going in, you can all of a sudden start to see how an overcontribution can happen and you didn't even realize.
Yeah, I think all the different money sources, you have to keep track of it all. It can be a lot.
Yes.
So on that point, where can an investor go to sort this all out and get an accurate reading of what is my actual RSP contribution?
Yes, good question. So number one, I'm going to say go check out your last year's notice of assessment. So in this case, it'll be your 2024 notice of assessment. I realize that's confusing because it's 2026. I'm saying last year, but no, it's going to be your 2024 notice of assessment that you have to look at. And just at the bottom, there's going to be a pretty clear line that states your 2025 contribution limit is X. So that's your starting point. Now, if we start to play around with, okay, well, I have maybe contributions coming in from my employer. Maybe I have my own RSP set up with TD Direct Investing, or maybe I have a bonus coming in that I have the option of rolling it into my RSP. How much room do I have? So you can look at the number of what is my contribution limit. So, okay, number one. Number two, let's start to add up how much you've contributed at your employer so far this year, using the example here. Keep in mind that, again, it gets a little bit confusing because a lot of times, even though we're looking at a tax year, which is Jan 1 to December 31st, the RSPs are often viewed March 1st to February 28th of the next year. So keep that in mind. So I would encourage investors to look at how much have they contributed to their RSP from what would be after March 3rd, 2025 to December 31st, 2025. Then consider how much have I contributed between January 1, 2026 and what I will have contributed by March 2nd, 2026. So remember to look at what you've already contributed and what you're going to contribute for the rest of the year. We're filming this early February, so people haven't contributed yet their February contributions. So take a look at what happened in 2025, what's happened in 2026, and then start to think, okay, if I add my company bonus here, am I going to over-contribute? If I do a lump sum contribution through my own self-directed account, am I going to do an over-contribution? So just kind of keep those timeframes in mind, those calendar dates in mind as well, and tally them up to what the available room is you have.
Yeah, there is some nuance to this account, of course, and a little bit of number juggling, but
yes.
That's a good framework to work with. Let's get to your next strategy, Kate, and this is to basically automatically adjust the taxes that you're getting on your paycheck. How can that, first off, be done? Because I think a lot of people might not even know that's a thing. But then secondly, how can that help you out with RSP contributions?
Yeah, for sure. So that's a great question. And it can be a good strategy. I will preface this by saying I think it works best for folks that have fairly stable and predictable income, okay? So how this would work is, remember, it's really nice to get a refund. We like getting the refund. It's nice to get money back, right, versus owing money. So, but you owe money, you would get money back because you had withholding tax off your pay stub, and maybe you made an RSP contribution. So all that combined is what led to the refund. And so we're paying tax throughout the year, but then we're ultimately getting it back when we file our tax return. So imagine if we didn't pay that tax through the year, or we paid less of it. This is sort of the strategy I think you had in mind. So again, if I'm someone that has stable income and I'm making regular RSP contributions, I can apply to CRA to sort of get a permission form for my employer to withhold less tax off my paycheck. Because my employer is going to withhold what the prescribed rates are that they're told to withhold. But I can go to CRA, and there's a form, I believe it's a T1213 form, that I can fill out, and I can justify why I think I need less withholding tax, wait for CRA to get back to me, get that permission form, and hand it over to my payroll administration team and say, okay, don't withhold as much tax off my paycheck. What does this mean? Well, it means less money is going to tax, more is going to my pocket. I can use that money that's going to my pocket to actually make bigger RSP contributions. And so now when I file my tax return at the end of the year, I have my income, I paid tax. I didn't pay maybe as much tax as I had previously paid, but then I made a big RSP contribution, so it sort of nets out. And if done correctly, I owe nothing on my tax return, nor do I get anything back, but I was in more control of the money throughout the year. Really important to remember, though, that that works well if we know exactly what our income is going to be. But it's not unusual for someone to maybe have rental income, to have a non-registered account that's going to yield things like interest, dividends, capital gains. That's all going to shoot up my income on me. Spousal support payments are taxable. So if you have these other sources of income coming at you, you might not want to implement this strategy. But if you just earn a T4 paycheck, this could work for you.
Yeah, pretty nifty solution, and it almost kind of forces that pay yourself first mentality, which can be really powerful.
But you have to do it, right? You have to make sure the money that you get doesn't get spent on something. It goes towards putting it in the RSP. Otherwise, you're going to get a big tax bill in April.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And nobody likes a big tax bill, that's for sure. Let's get to your next strategy, and this one is to invest enough in your RRSP to drop yourself down a tax bracket. Take us through, first off, a little bit about tax brackets, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about how taxes in Canada work, but also how can this help juice our RRSPs?
Yes, okay, so this is probably my most favorite, or the strategy that I implement the most with my clients. So the Canadian tax system is progressive, so the more we make, the more we get taxed. However, it's not like every dollar is taxed at a higher rate, but rather as we start to earn income and we go above certain thresholds, the dollars above those thresholds are taxed at higher amounts. And those thresholds are referred to as marginal tax brackets. So simply put, if I make $117,000 a year, every dollar I make above $117,000 is going to be taxed at about 43%. If I make between $111,000 and $117,000, every dollar I make above $111,000 is taxed at 38%. I hit $117,000, and now dollars above $117,000 are getting taxed at 43%. So that's how the marginal tax system sort of works in Canada. So imagine, I like to use numbers for my examples. Again, say I make $120,000 a year. Great, make $120,000 a year. Those dollars between $117 and $120 are getting taxed at about 43%. If I make a $3,000 RSP contribution, I should get back about 43 cents for every dollar I put into my RSP, because I'm going from $120,000 of income, and I'm getting a $3,000 deduction to bring me down to 117. And if we look at the chart to look at the marginal tax rates, I can see that I'm at 43%. So every dollar into my RSP gets me back 43 cents. And that's a strategy you might want to implement when you're making RSP contributions. And just to keep that in mind, there's a couple areas, and as you can see on the chart, where these marginal tax rates change quite a bit. One of them, of course, is at the $117,000 mark. So if you make around $117,000 a year, yeah, definitely it makes sense to make an RSP contribution, because then you're going to get yourself knocked down to a 38% marginal tax bracket. That's a pretty good difference. The other one is going to be around $58,000. So if I make slightly above or above $58,000 to about $94,000, every dollar I put into my RSP is going to save me almost 30 cents in tax, and I can get down to then a 23% marginal tax bracket. So these are good numbers and charts to have in front of you when you're deciding what RSP contribution to make.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some great calculators you can find online too that can kind of do a lot of this work for you. The example we showed on screen was for like a combined federal and Ontario tax bracket, but of course in different provinces it'll be different. This is a really interesting and straightforward strategy. Let's up the ante a little bit, okay? Play on this little, gamesmanship, let's say, with the tax brackets, because your next strategy is to consider an RRSP gross up. A lot of people probably haven't heard of this strategy. Yeah. Take us through, how does this thing work?
Yes, okay, and I'm going to try to keep it simple with the numbers, because we do start to get some equations going with this one. So the RSP gross up strategy is meant to really maximize how much an investor can put into their RSP without having to jeopardize their day-to-day cash flow or take out a loan that they can't necessarily afford to pay back. How it works is, just say I'm an investor and I contribute on a regular basis to my RSP. I decide I want to do a top-up right before the deadline. So I do a top-up in an amount that I would expect to get back in the form of a refund when I file my taxes. And so the calculation actually works out being the amount of the gross up I should do is what you expect your refund to be before the gross up, and then divide that by 1 minus your marginal tax rate. But again, what it's meant to do is put in extra money into your RSP. That extra money you put in, you will get that back in the form of a refund after you file. And if you don't have the money on hand, because maybe it's like $5,000, $10,000 you want to put in, we might not have that readily available in our bank account. You could consider taking from another source, like a tax-free savings account, or you could consider taking out a very short-term loan for the purpose of putting it into your RSP. Of course, obviously, we want to make sure we're aware of the risks before we take out any sort of loan.
Okay, so I'm a numbers guy too. I'm an example person.
Yes.
Can you maybe give us an example to kind of just spell this all out? Because this can be a really powerful strategy, and I don't want people to get scared away right off the bat with like all these equations and stuff. Take us through it.
Yeah, so I think a pretty realistic example could be, say we have an investor, we'll call him Ben. Just say he puts $1,000 towards his RSP every month. So pretty good. He has a lot of RSP room. He makes good money. So he's at about a 40% marginal tax bracket in Ontario. So that would be sort of like a combination of his Canadian and his provincial taxes. So he puts $1,000 into his RSP every month. Over the course of a year, that's $12,000 at a 40% marginal tax rate. That is a $4,800 expected refund. That is great. Now, if he was to try to implement this gross up strategy, what he would do is he would say, okay, my expected refund is $4,800. I want to top that up a little bit. How much should I do? So he would calculate this to be $4,800 divided by 1 minus his marginal tax rate, which is 1 minus 0.4. $4,800 divided by 0.6, easy, is $8,000. Okay, so now he comes up with an extra $8,000 and he puts that into his RSP. So instead of making a $12,000 contribution, he has made a $20,000 RSP contribution. Again, it's $12,000 plus $8,000, $20,000 RSP contribution at a 40% tax bracket. That is a $8,000 refund, which conveniently is the amount of the top up that he did, right? So that's where the gross up strategy comes in. He added more to the RSP and he got back in the form of a refund exactly what that top up amount was. So he can use that to pay back whatever source he used to take the funds from initially.
And so this is great because you're getting money into this great vehicle, RRSP.
Yeah.
You're getting more in, you're getting it in earlier, and you're basically covering it through this tax brinksmanship, I guess, a little bit, or gamesmanship.
Yeah, and then like going back to what we talked about earlier, this whole idea of compounding interest is that, okay, well now I've put more money into my RSP, and what did I say at the beginning? The more you can put in the earlier, the power of compounding interest, it's going to be exponential, and it's really not like in some ways costing you anything because you're getting that refund back that you can pay back your source that you took it from. But the more money you put in, the longer it has to invest. And we just know, like we've all seen the investment charts that show the power of compounding interest over time. And
I think let's take it to the next level because this was a one-year example. It sounds like there's a really big increase, obviously, in the amount of contribution that you're making to your RSP. Let's extrapolate that over time. I think we have a chart that kind of shows this because this can make a big difference, particularly over many years if you repeatedly did this.
Yeah, exactly. And so if I keep doing this and I keep putting it in, again, it's that value of the compounding interest, and then I'm getting a bigger refund than I would have otherwise have gotten, and then I can, you know, if you haven't borrowed the money, you just had the cash flow available, I mean, you could put the refund back into the RSP and it just kind of like grows on itself. Yeah.
And I mean, we're talking about a pretty substantial difference looking at this chart, the yellow line being the one if we pursued this gross up for 10 years. It's a really big gap between just doing your typical reinvesting the refund, which is still great. And of course, we can also highlight much better than spending the refund.
Yes.
That goes without saying. But we're talking about pretty substantial difference in numbers here. So it's powerful stuff. That said, I can see people being intrigued on the one hand by the strategy, also a little bit anxious that they don't want to screw something up. Maybe I'm projecting my own insecurities with numbers because I stopped taking math in grade 10. But where do people tend to mess up their calculations, and maybe what can they do to avoid that?
Yeah, and I definitely appreciate that this is a little bit complicated in terms of how much should I put in, and the example we gave was very clean. It was 40% tax bracket, like very clean numbers. The reality is it's not always as straightforward. So this can get a little bit tripped up if I'm moving around, the contribution is causing me to shift marginal tax brackets. Remember, I talked about these different thresholds. So if my contribution is causing me to fall below certain thresholds, it maybe might not be as powerful, or I might not need to put in as much of a gross up. Another thing to keep in mind is that I made the comment sometimes people will borrow money to implement this strategy. And where it can get slipped up is just say I borrowed that $8,000, but then, I don't know, life happens and I needed to spend that on something else. And now instead of putting $8,000 into my RSP extra, I'm only putting in $5,000. The strategy is not going to work as well. I'm not going to get as big a refund, and I'm not going to be able to pay back that loan in full that I took out. So that's kind of just something to keep in mind. Like if you're doing this strategy, you need to really see it through. And not have the money kind of go elsewhere in the meantime.
I could see a lot of people, not having all that extra cash on hand, of course, like who does? Particularly if you're like a diligent investor and you're already plugging away pretty much all the spare money that you have. And then on the other hand, too, being reticent to take out any kind of RRSP loan, even if you know it'll probably work out, I'll probably pay it off in like a couple months. Are there any like alternatives where they could still take advantage of this strategy without having to go either one of those?
Yeah, no, for sure. A couple things to keep in mind is if you had a non-registered account and the money was sitting not really invested or there wasn't a big gain on it, you could consider taking money from there to put into your RSP. Another strategy, which would not impact your taxes at all, would actually be to take money out of a tax-free savings account if you have one. Now, you made the comment, like, if you're a diligent investor and you're already putting money everywhere, one thing to keep in mind is that if you have done that and you have a TFSA and you max it out every year, keep in mind that when you take money out of a tax-free savings account, you can't replace those same dollars until the following calendar year. Right. So one thing to keep in mind is if you want to take money out of your tax-free savings account to do this strategy, one thing you could do is like plan to take the money out of the tax-free savings account at the end of December. Right now it's in your bank account, end of December, it's available to do an RSP top up in January or February. And now, because we're in the next calendar year, you can top up your TFSA with the new contribution limit, which is currently $7,000, plus whatever you took out of your TFSA in December. If you took money out of your TFSA in April or February, you can't pay it back until 2027. So just something to keep in mind with the timelines. All allowed, you're just playing within the rules smartly.
With all things tax, it seems like a little bit of forward thinking is always needed, but that's a great call out with the TFSA withdrawals and stuff like that. Fantastic explanation of what can be quite a complicated strategy, so thank you for that, Jacqueline. Let's get to your next one. This one's a little bit cheeky, I have to say. Intentionally over-contributing to your RRSP by up to $2,000. Yeah. We know, and you mentioned earlier, that there can be some pretty uncomfortable penalties for over-contribution. So how are you skirting the line here in a way that's like technically above board and can help juice an RRSP up?
Yes, and I promise I'm not contradicting myself here because I did say earlier, do not over-contribute to your RSP. So one thing that you can do, though, is you are allowed to over-contribute by $2,000 over your lifetime, not per year, over your lifetime. And so what I've seen some investors do is people who have maxed out their TFSAs, maybe they have an RESP, they've maxed that out, they've maxed out their RSP, the spouse has maxed out on their RSP, and they're just looking for anywhere else that they can tax defer a few dollars. Yes, you can actually intentionally over-contribute by $2,000 to your RSP without penalty. Keep in mind that when you put the extra $2,000 in above your limit, you're not going to get any sort of tax deduction. You're doing it simply because you'd rather have the money in a tax-deferred account than having it in a non-registered account, which is exposed to taxes on an annual basis.
Right. So you're sort of bending the rules, not breaking them.
Yes, and again, it is a lifetime limit, not per year, because again, if you over-contribute, the fines are quite steep. I think it's like 1% per month, and then you got to go through the hassle of taking the money out.
Yeah. Then, all of a sudden, that $2,000 that sounded great is like a huge headache, not necessarily worth it, probably in most cases. So anyway, that's a great call out. Let's get to your last strategy that we have time for, and this is using a spousal RRSP. This is like a really interesting strategy too. How can a spousal RRSP help reduce the combined tax burden that a couple would have?
Yeah, so I really like the spousal RSP strategy. I think that spousal RSPs might have been a more popular back before like the early 2000s, and that's because some of the pension income splitting rules changed. But the point is that it is a strategy that allows spouses to guarantee income splitting in the future. And so how that generally works is if we have a household and there's two spouses or common law partners and one spouse is earning significantly more than the other, they might say, okay, I'm going to take my earnings and I'm going to put it into my RSP. That's going to impact my own RSP contribution room. However, I'm going to get a big deduction. And now I have a giant RSP and my spouse has a small RSP. By doing the spousal RSP strategy, it allows me to direct some of what I would have put into my own RSP into my spouse's RSP. It's not my spouse's RSP, it's their spousal RSP. When I do that, I'm using up my own contribution room to do that. So I'm taking some of my money, I'm putting into my spouse's spousal RSP. That does impact my own contribution room. However, I also get the deduction as a result of putting money into the spousal RSP. This can be, I think it's really great because then in the future, instead of one spouse having maybe like a large RSP, there's sort of these two more equal balanced RSPs. So not only does it help with income splitting for the future, It also, I think, creates some monetary equality within the household as well, which I really like. And so if we just think of some of the numbers, like if I had all the money in my RSP and I took it out, I might be in a much higher tax bracket. But again, by splitting it with my spouse, I take money out at my tax rate and they're going to be able to take money out at maybe their lower tax rate in the future, which could be maybe a 10% differential in the tax rates.
Yeah, and depending if you creep up into those higher brackets, like it could make a big difference potentially. Anything that people need to be aware of if they want to do a spousal RRSP ahead of the contribution deadline?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the spousal RSP, remember, like if I'm, for example, in my case, like if I have a spousal RSP for my husband, once I put money into that spousal RSP for him, like that money no longer belongs to me. Like it is totally his to control and do what he wants with. And so I am kind of giving up ownership of that money. If he wants to go invest it in something which I think is totally incorrect, that's in his power to do, right? So I am giving up control when I do that. Another thing to keep in mind is that if he were to turn around and like take money out of the spousal RSP that year, or I think the next 2 years, that would be taxed back to me. Because you can imagine like a very simple thing that people would do is they'd say, okay, I'm gonna put money into the spousal RSP, I'm gonna get a big tax deduction because I'm at a 50% marginal tax bracket, and then my spouse is gonna take the money out right away and only pay 20%. No, CRA sees right through that. So you have to wait a few years before your spouse is allowed to take any of the money out of the spousal RSP. Otherwise, I'm gonna get hit with a tax bill as a result of them doing that.
Yeah, that's not good. And another, I guess, piece of forward thinking too is don't try to do this like the day before the deadline, right?
Yeah, let's just wait. Sometimes it's really quick to open up an account. Sometimes, like if you don't already have a spousal RSP and you are thinking you want to do this strategy, give yourself a few days. Sometimes I find these types of accounts, because there's government forms involved, take a little bit longer to open up. So if you're going to do this, start today in trying to open up the spousal RSP and making the contribution. There's no need to add extra stress for anyone.
Well, Jacqueline, this has been fantastic. A lot of strategies that I think a lot of people either weren't aware of, they're a little bit outside of the box in some cases, but can really help power the growth of an RRSP. So thank you for sharing those. We got a lot more to get to, including our live Q&A. So I'm curious to see what others want to know about. We'll get to that in just a moment. But before we continue, I have a quick question for our viewers. Are you enjoying the show so far? Have you learned a lot? I'm sure you have. And if you have, make sure you follow TD Direct Investing on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook to get a sneak peek at upcoming episodes of this show, and as well as our others, as well as a ton of other content designed to help build your investing knowledge. Lots of great stuff on there. Make sure you want to check that out. All right, now, like I said, our live viewer Q&A coming up in just a few minutes, so get your questions in if you haven't asked them already. But I want to bring in my colleague Caitlin Cormier first, because she's going to show us how to find some of the information about our RRSPs in WebBroker that can help make all of this just like a smoother process. Caitlin, welcome to the show. Great to have you back.
Thanks, Rob. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. And so tell us, like, where is the place where all of these tax documents and things relevant to the RRSP are stored in WebBroker that can help make the whole process smooth come springtime?
Yeah, absolutely. So extremely important to know where these documents are. So let's get right into WebBroker. We're going to be able to go under the menu here that says Settings and Services, and right there, Documents, e-Services. Pretty straightforward to find. And here you're going to see all of your annual statements for your different accounts, your confirmations for trades, and of course, most important for this conversation is your tax documents. So you can identify which year you're looking for, and keep in mind you're going to have for RSP contributions specifically, you're going to get a December 31st statement, which shows all of your contributions from the previous RSP contribution deadline to December 31st. And then every time you make a contribution in the new year, they're going to send you another contribution slip. So if you're doing those bi-weekly contributions like me, then you're going to receive those bi-weekly tax slips for every single contribution you make between now and that RSP contribution deadline.
Awesome. Okay, so a one-stop shop in a lot of respects. But that said, let's say I want to do some kind of RRSP strategy, or I have some kind of question. Yeah, sure, I could go down the Google rabbit hole and maybe find something, but then I might find all kinds of nonsense too. Is there some place where I can go to get some quick answers and authoritative answers in WebBroker?
Yeah, quality of information is extremely important, especially when it comes to things like your taxes, your retirement savings. So a couple places I'm going to show you quickly in WebBroker. The first one is we're going to go under the Accounts tab. And then way over on the right-hand side, there is a self-service spot. And if you click the Tax Information Center, this is a great place to come. There's a bunch of frequently asked questions here. So if you want to understand, maybe a different tax slip, maybe you've got more complicated tax needs and you want to learn more, there's lots of information listed here. The other thing I would suggest that you do is just go ahead and hit that search bar. In case you didn't see, just right in the middle of the screen there, click search and then, type in RSP contribution, and it'll actually pop up and show you video lessons like these Inside Investing episodes that we've brought in experts to talk about, or different articles that are available. So that's another great resource. Instead of going to Google, stick right within the WebBroker platform and search, and you can get some good, credible information.
Fantastic stuff, Caitlin. Making it easy for us. Much appreciated, as always. That's Caitlin Cormier, TD Direct Investing's Senior Client Education Instructor. Okay, Jacqueline, the moment is upon us, the live viewer Q&A. We're going to open the floodgates, see what people want to know more about. Are you ready?
I hope so.
All right, let's get to it. Let's call up our first question. What do we have on tap here? When does it make sense to contribute to an RSP? Just getting that in my ear. And borrow money to contribute to an RSP.
Okay, I would say it might make a lot of sense to borrow for an RSP contribution if we're dealing with like cash flow timing. So you might be expecting a big bonus to come in, but your company doesn't pay out bonuses till March 15th, but you had a really big income the previous year, and you're like, I gotta do something to bring down my tax bill. I know that bonus money's coming like 2 weeks after the deadline. So that could be an instance where it's like, I gotta reduce my tax bill, I'm gonna make the RSP contribution, and I know that I'm gonna be able to pay it back because I might get a refund, or I know that bonus money is coming in and it's just a timing issue. Okay, that makes sense. And thank you to my producer, Alicia, in my ear here, telling us what the question was. Let's get to our next question, though. This one coming to us from Felix. Felix is saying, a past guest speaker suggested that dividend investors prioritize a TFSA over an RRSP if they can only max one account. Do you agree? Felix, thank you for being a loyal viewer to the program and referencing a past guest there. What do you think, Jacqueline? Yeah, great question. So I would say, this is particularly true if we're looking at someone that's not in a particularly high marginal tax bracket. The reason for that is because any money we put into the RSP, we're not expected to get as big a refund or reduction in taxes owing. One thing I like about the dividend strategy is because we could look at this if we're thinking about retirement. Okay, I put money in my TFSA, I invest in dividend paying stocks. I can take out those dividends on an annual basis, tax-free, without touching my principal. So I think I really like this strategy, especially for someone who isn't maybe in a high tax bracket, like at a certain part of their career, but is expected for some reason to have higher income later in life and would really benefit from having tax-free income later in life so they can take advantage of pulling dividend money out of their TFSA tax-free. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, then maybe it's a case where that dividend snowball that they're building gets like really, really, really large. Great place to be.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you don't have to worry about the tax aspect.
Yeah, so just keep that in mind. One thing to mention is that there is a withholding tax on U.S. dividend-paying stocks. So if I get paid a U.S. dividend in my tax-free savings account, there's going to be a bit of a withholding tax, and so I would probably have been better off holding that U.S. dividend-paying stock in my RSP. There's a tax treaty there. I'm not going to get the withholding tax. So just keep in mind like what you're putting in the TFSA that's generating those dividends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, good call out. Let's get to our next question then. Our next question coming to us from John. John says, if I live in Ontario and I earn $140,000, how should I determine how much to contribute to an RRSP to maximize my tax benefit?
Okay, good. Okay, I like this question a lot.
Little case study.
Yeah, a little case study. So if we reflect back, and if this is the only income that we're receiving, if we reflect back on the marginal tax bracket chart that we had up, I believe $140,000 is sitting at the 43% marginal tax bracket. And so, if you had the money available, like I would maybe put in about $23,000 if you could, and provided you have the room, because that's going to bring you down from $140,000 to $117,000, and every dollar I put into my RSP is going to get me back 43 cents, either in the form of a refund or deduction of taxes owing. The question was, how can I maximize the refund, and so it would be bringing you down to that next tax bracket at $117,000. So without knowing anything else about this investor and not knowing their room, I would say $23,000 would get you there.
Yeah, and they are sitting in that sweet spot, I guess, if you will, on the tax bracket chart there, where if they can drop down, they're going to get sort of outsized savings, let's say, on the tax side. So okay, that's fantastic. Look at you doing the mental math like that, right on the spot. I love it. Let's get to our next question. This one coming to us from Amy. Planning for FIRE, financial independence, retire early at 50 with my RRSP. Bravo to you, Amy. What should I consider when converting it to a RIF before a traditional retirement age?
Okay. Okay, so we're retiring at 50, and we know that we need to convert our RSP to a RIF in the year we turn 71, and we need to start withdrawing from our RIF, Registered Retirement Income Fund, the year we turn 72. So stuff to consider. Amy, you could consider, I would look at what your overall income is. At age 50, you're too young for CPP and old age security, but maybe you're collecting a retirement pension from an employer. So I would consider, you could take a look at converting a portion of your RSP to a RIF if you wanted, and then making regular withdrawals from there. This would avoid you having to pay some of the mandatory withholding tax if you just had kept it as an RSP. So I would consider moving a portion of your RSP to a RIF if it makes sense. Consider what your other taxable income is going to be. Like if you have a large non-registered account, that might be producing a lot of income for you. A big one, especially if you're married, is that you can start pension income splitting your RIF account at age 65. So once you hit 65, if you have no other sources of income, you might want to consider converting the RSP to a RIF, and at that age you would be allowed to pension income split with a spouse as well. You can't do it before age 65.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point about converting some of the RSP to a RIF. I think some people might be under the impression like it's an all or nothing decision. It doesn't have to be.
Yeah, and I would just have to go back because I can't remember at what age you're allowed to convert to a RIF. 50 might be a bit early, so I could be a bit off here. Also keep in mind that if you do convert your RSP to a RIF early, you might be eligible for the pension tax credit, which is about $2,000 worth of tax credit.
Okay. Great food for thought there. And Amy, again, congratulations on the milestone that you're pursuing there. That's pretty great. I'd sign up for that too. Let's get to our next question. This one coming to us from Aaliyah. How does a spousal RSP work if the couple later gets divorced? Dun, dun, dun. Uh-oh. I mean, like, hey, it happens.
Yeah.
What happens if that happens?
Yeah, so I mean, I've seen this a lot, right? Like I have a lot of clients that have been through divorce and they have their spousal RSP. I think kind of the first thing to say is like it's going to depend on how the lawyer wants to split up the assets. So technically the spousal RSP does belong to you. So if I set up a spousal RSP for my husband and then we split up, like that spousal RSP does belong to him. How the lawyer decides to split stuff up, that's a different story. But assuming that he kept the spousal RSP, it would still be a spousal RSP. You know, sometimes you can ask your financial institution to convert it to just an RSP only under your name. Like you can roll it into an existing RSP because the spousal RSP generally has the ex-spouse's name still on the account name. So nothing really different happens and you still own the account. And you can probably roll it into your RSP if you want. You'd have to provide certain documentation to the financial institution, like a divorce certificate, but really nothing. It's not really treated much differently. It sort of just acts as an RSP still.
Okay, yeah, I mean, like so many variables with a situation like divorce, so hopefully it doesn't come to that, but if it does, at least the spousal RSP, hopefully might not be that complicated, at least to deal with.
Yeah, but remember, when you do make a spousal RSP contribution for your spouse, like you are giving up control of that money.
Yeah, good point. Okay, let's keep this train rolling. What else do we have on tap? This one coming to us from Sue. Can money be transferred between a spousal RSP and an individual RSP in the future?
I believe so, and I think this kind of piggybacks off our last question. So it's going to be like if you have especially if you've gone through a divorce, that can probably, I believe you can. I've done it. I've taken the spousal name off the spousal RSP. So I think for this one, it would be best just to contribute to ask your financial institution like the rules around, can I roll it in? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next question coming to us from Priyanka. What investment strategies do you recommend for RSP contributions? Now, of course, we can't give explicit financial advice, but in general, do you think that there are certain strategies or types of investments that play nicely in an RSP?
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of mentioned earlier, right? Like if you're a younger investor and you have the risk threshold for it, yeah, you might want to go something that's a little bit more equity based. As we start to get closer to retirement and maybe we're making RSP contributions, we might want to be a little bit more conservative. However, I would encourage you to consider, like, when am I actually going to need this money? And let's not just assume that because I'm retiring next year, I need to be super conservative. Again, some of the money in your RSP might not be touched for another 20 years. So I would focus on time horizon and what your risk capacity is. On that note, though, I'm just going to back up a bit. So if I'm looking at like an overall account portfolio, like an investor who has non-registered TFSA and RSP, from a taxation perspective, I'm more likely to put some of the interest-bearing investments in an RSP and maybe my U.S. dividend-paying stocks, and as opposed to putting any interest-bearing investments in a non-registered account.
Right.
So maybe the question was geared towards more like the taxation. There's certain assets fit better in an RSP than others.
Yeah. And like certainly I can think too of like Canadian dividend stocks. Like a lot of people don't want to hold that in an RSP because you can take advantage of the Canadian dividend tax credit if it's like in a non-reg.
Yeah.
Or like you were talking about earlier, TFSA, and you don't have to worry about like the tax aspect of things if you know you're going to be getting regular dividends. So lots to consider, but appreciate you sharing that. That's all the time we have for the Q&A, but fantastic job taking some of those questions. RSPs can be complicated, and look at you just like handling it all like a total pro. Love it. Fantastic stuff. We appreciate you joining us as always. We'll have to have you back again soon.
Thank you.
And of course, to our audience, thank you so much for joining us as well. Make sure you check out next week's show because we have an interesting one. We are challenging one of the popular ideas among some investors that bonds are bad for your portfolio's returns. Okay, a lot of people have this misconception, but it turns out it's not quite that simple. So tune in to find out why. That's all the time we have for this edition of the show. From everyone on the crew, thanks again for watching. We'll see you all next time.